Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Yud Tes of Masechta Sheqalim. Well, we're going to study two Mishnayos today, and they talk about when you find things in front of, when you find things closer, depends what's closer to what or what's in between what. So that's kind of the focus of today. Let's get started. We're going to begin the 7th parak of Masechta Sheqalim. It says the Mishnah Ma'oshe Nimtzu bein Ashkalim Linedava. So if you find money, right? Remember there were 13 chests on Har HaBayis. Now, some of these chests were for Sheqalim. Some of these chests were for putting money in for the Ketz Mizbeach Nedava offerings. So Ma'oshe Nimtzu bein Ashkalim Linedava. So if you find money between the shekel chest and the Nedava chest, the Olas Ketz Mizbeach chest, Karv Sheqalim Yiplu Sheqalim, the Nedava Yiplu Nedava. So Lemaise, it depends what it's closer to. If it's closer to the Sheqalim, so we assume that the money came from the Sheqalim chest. If it's closer to the Nedava, then we assume that the money came from the Nedava chest. However, Mechza LaMechza, what happens if it's smack in the middle? So Yiplu Nedava. So we assume that it's for the Nedava. If you find money between the chest for the trees and the chest for the levona, the frankincense, okay, so if it depends what it's closer. If it's closer to the wood, so we assume it came from the wood chest. If it's closer to the levona, so we assume that it's shaykh to the levona. But if it's smack in the middle, what do you do? So we assume that it's levona. What if you find money between the chest for the bird pairs versus the Ola birds chest? Same halacha. Depends what it's closer to. Closer to kinin, closer to gozle ola, it's gozle ola. Smack in the middle, we assume that it's for the gozle ola. So when you have chulin, now these are not chests, because after all, I don't remember there being a chest for chulin and a chest for ma'aser sheni. This is talking about in general. If you have some regular money, and you have money upon which you consecrated your ma'aser sheni, and now you have to take this money to Jerusalem, and you find a coin between the two piles, so which one does it belong to? So the same mahalach, whichever one it's closer to. Closer to chulin, so you assume it's chulin. It's closer to ma'aser sheni, you assume it's ma'aser sheni. Smack in the middle, so you assume it's ma'aser sheni, and concludes the Mishnah, Ze klal. This is the general rule, holchin achar akarv lahakil mechza lahachmir, that we always go based on what it's closer to, regardless if that means we're going to be more stringent or more lenient. Right, so meaning you have a pile of ma'aser sheni and a pile of chulin. If the money is closer to the chulin, we assume it's chulin, even though that's going to be more lenient than saying it's ma'aser sheni. Whatever it is, you go based on what's closer. However, mechza lahachmir. But if it's smack in the middle, we don't know which one it's shaykh to, then we have to be more stringent. So, an easy case that's easy to distinguish would be the chulin and the ma'aser sheni. So when it's smack in the middle, we have to be more stringent and assume that the money is ma'aser sheni money. Zok the Gemara, or really fact the Gemara. So I don't know how to translate this literally, but what the question means is like, how are you going to have Sheqalim close to the kinim? No, I'm sorry. I think the question is really, how are you going to have the Sheqalim close to the Nedava, right? I mean, in the first case in the Mishnah, is that what if you find Sheqalim, or if you find some money between the shekel chest and the Nedava chest? And the question is, well, if you look at the previous Mishnah, that's talking about all the chests, well, the first one is the shekels, and the last one is the Nedava. So if you imagine them in one long row, how are you going to have the money between the shekel and the Nedava? What it should say is what the Gemara is asking is, don't you mean between the shekels and the kinim and the bird pairs? To which the Gemara says, no, we mean what we said. Rab Avon b'shem Pinchas k'min buchlayer hayu osin, period. The chests were in a circle formation, and therefore, yes, if you find money between the Nedava, which were the last, and the shekels, which is where it starts. So kilu, if you imagine a circle, so you can have the money between the nedava, which is first, and the shekels, which is first, and the nedava, which is last. Got it? Good. Weiter. Mechza lemechza yipulu nedava. Okay, so we said that if the money is halfway between the shekels and the nedava, so you assume that it's for the nedava. Is the by meimar. So how come we assume that it's nedava as opposed to shekels, right? It's smack in the middle. How come we decide that we're going to treat it as nedava money as opposed to shekel money? So the answer is, so we give two answers. One possibility is, one possibility is, well, what happens if the shekels don't end up in the, right, remember, you would go into the lishka and you would take out 3 chests worth of shekels, and whatever didn't make it into those 3 chests when they would do the Trumas Alishka would remain there, and that was Shiari Alishka, and it was used for maintenance projects, which is not hektish. It's regular, it's chulin, and maintenance projects. So therefore, if we have this money, it's found smack in the middle, and if we treat it as a shekel, there's the possibility that it could just end up for maintenance projects, whereas if we treat it as an idava, we know that it'll be offered as an ola, so we'd prefer that. Is the boy Meimar, Mechza lemechza k'mi shemes. Or there are those who want to say that the reason why we treat the money found smack in the middle as an idava as opposed to a shekel is because we treat this money in the same way that we treat somebody who set aside money for his shekel and then passed away. Reb Yasa, because after all, Reb Yasa said, who is Reb Yossi, I believe, Reb Yossi the Amora, when I was still in Bavel before I came to Eretz Yisrael, Shamois called Rav Yehuda Shal l'Shmuel, that I heard Rav Yehuda ask Shmuel, here for Shiklov Ames, what happens in a case where somebody sets aside a shekel and passes away? To which Shmuel responded, it's nedava. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. If you have a fellow who sets aside money for a shekel and then he passes away, so the money is treated as an idava, and therefore since we treat, or we want to argue that we treat the money that's found smack in the middle between a shekel, the shekel chest, and the nedava chest, we want to treat it in the same way that we treat it, the money of someone who set aside as a shekel and passed away, and therefore it is treated like a nedava. Asir sa'efa shelo, the tenth of an ephah of the minchas chavitin that the Kohen Gadol would offer every day in the Beis HaMikdash. What happens if there's extra? Let's say you set aside money and there's more money than was needed. Rabbi Yochanan says that you take the money to the Dead Sea and you chuck it in Darton. Reb Lazar Amar Yipul L'Nedava, whereas Reb Lazar says that the leftover money is for these voluntary offerings. Vikasha v'yeshchatas kreva ola. Now moving on to the birds, right? We said that if there was money found smack between the kinin and the gozle ola, so we treat them like gozle ola. Now, what's the kinim? The kinim are the 2 birds of Azav, Zava, Yoledes. So, what are those 2 birds? One is a chatas and one is an ola. Now, if we treat the money that's found right in the middle between the 2 chests, the kine, the kinim chests and the gozle ola chests, and we're saying treat the money as gozle ola, well, then that means that you're going to be using them for olas. But what about the fact that if this money was in fact for the kinim, one of those 2 birds for the kinim was a chatas, which means that in practice you're going to be offering a chatas as an ola. Meaning, in the event that this money was really for the kinim, one of which was a chatas, and you're saying treat it as gozle ola, you'll be offering essentially a chatas as an ola. Oy va'avoy. Chizkiya b'shem Rab Shimon ben Lakish, Tanai bezdinu, uwa, ala mosar shikvu olis. Uwa. So says Chizkiya, in the name of Rab Shimon ben Lakish, that it's a Tanai bezdin. What's a Tanai bezdin? I'm not exactly sure. But it's this interesting thing. I remember we learned it in Masechta Ksubis. I could tell you, I was learning with my old chavrusa of Yosef Gutman Levitt. Good year of Yosef Gutman. We learned, of course, maybe you remember him from past episodes. I probably mentioned him once or twice. We learned B'chavrusa for 8 years. And over the course of the 8 years, we learned in different locations. I believe that we were learning about Tanai Bezdin in Masechet Ksubis. We were learning in the Beis Medrash at Kilas Chaverim. We were learning one afternoon. And anyways, I don't think we really knew what Tanai Bezdin was. We were just kind of going with the flow. Anyways, Tanai Bezdin seems to be this like interesting thing where like the Bezdin can just kind of like make up rules. I wonder if it's like connected to like Hefker Bezdin Hefker, how like Bezdin can just kind of like make things ownerless and stuff. So anyways, it's a Tanai Bezdin. Means, almost feels like a wild card kind of thing. Bezdin decided that Ala Mosar Shikivu Olis, that when you have leftover Chatas money, it can be offered as an Ola. And therefore, we treat this money that is in between the Kinim, one of which is an Achatas, and between the Ola chest. So there's a Tanai Bezdin, there's this stipulation of Bezdin that when you have a leftover money from Achatas, it's going to be offered as an Ola, and therefore you can offer this money even in the event that this money was shaykh to the Kinim, one of which is Achatas, you would nonetheless be able to offer it as an Ola because we treat it as Mosar Hachatas. Ha'isha azos b'mei miskaperes, but then the Gemara says, wait, but nonetheless, okay, from a technical standpoint, you solved it. However, the fact of the matter is, how come this money was here in the first place? Well, you have, let's say, a woman who gave birth, and she has to bring these birds, one of which is a chatas, one of which is an ola. If we treat these as gozle ola, well, lemaisa, she didn't bring her kinim. So how is she going to get her kapara from the chatas? So Rabbi Yitzchak Tanai Bezdin, it's taka another Tanai Bezdin. Ha-misapik es akinin, hu-misapik es psulos. That we're going to learn, or did we already learn? Who can even remember? No, I think that we're going to learn that or did we already learn? Maybe we already learned. I think we already learned this. That at the end of the day, Yochanan ben Pinchas, who was in charge of the tokens, and Achia, who was in charge of giving out like the libations and stuff, or not. Oh gosh, who can even remember? But basically, the suppliers. No, I think we haven't done it yet. But the suppliers in the Beis Hamikdash, it's a machlokas between Tanakam and Rabbi Yossi, and we're assuming like Rabbi Yossi right now, which is that in the event that there were like missing birds or whatever, so the suppliers would have to make up for the missing stuff, and therefore what would happen is because we said that how do these birds work? How do these kinim work? Basically, you go to the Beis Hamikdash, you put your money into the kinim chest, and you can just assume that the Kohanim already offered your birds for you. We know this Masechta Eruvin. We learned it a few days ago over here, Masechta Sheqalim. Maybe it came up in Masechta Pesachim as well. Can't remember. Anyways, so you would put your money into the chest and assume that it was taken care of for you. Now, what happens if this money somehow was found in between, and you're assuming that it's Gozle Ola? So now this woman is assuming that her kinim were offered for her, but the fact of the matter is that they were given to the Gozle Ola because they were found in the middle. So we say don't worry about it, because whoever was supplying the birds for the Beis Hamikdash, they would notice that whatever was missing, or they would find this money in the middle, give it to the Olas, and then say that this guy needs to provide extra to make sure that just in case it was the kinim, this woman would be taken care of. So basically, she would be taken care of. Okay. Lo tzorcha de lo bein ktores le'etzim l'levon l'zav l'chapores. Lo bein ktores le'etzim l'levon l'zav l'chapores. Meaning, the Gemara is asking, what about the other boxes? Right? We talked about between the Dava and Sheqalim, between the Kinim and the Gozle Ola. What about the other ones? What about if you found money between Ktoris and the Eitzim? Or what about between the Levona and the Zav? So, V'tanisa v'sofa ze aklal holchen achar akarov mechza lemechza la'achmer. So we say, yeah, I mean that's why the Gemara that's why the Mishnah ended with a klal, with a general rule, which is that the general rule is you go based on what's closer. If it's smack in the middle, you're machmir. So that's how you would apply it to now. That's the way of saying, without going into details about every specific case, this is the rule that you will apply to those cases. New Mishnah halacha beis ma'oshinimtzu lifnei sochari behema Le'olam Meiser. So if you found money in Yerushalayim in front of animal dealers, okay, you will always assume that it's Meiser Sheni money. Because people come to Yerushalayim with Meiser Sheni money, they go to the meat dealers and they buy their korban. They buy the animal for their korban. So therefore, any money that is found on the floor in front of the animal dealers, so you're always going to assume that they are Meiser Sheni money. Uvahara Bais, what if you find some money on the Temple Mount? So Chulin, you assume that they're Chulin. The Gemara is going to explain why. Although we saw, I think, a different reason in Masechta Pesachim at the beginning of it, but the Gemara is going to give a reason. In Yerushalayim, what if you find money randomly in Yerushalayim, not in front of the animal merchants and not in the Harabais? So if it's just the rest of the year, a regular all day, so then you can assume that it's chulin. You found money in Yerushalayim, okay, it's money, whatever it is. It's not holy. However, if just in a random place in Jerusalem you find some money during the Shalosh Regalim, so then you have to assume that money is Meiser Sheni money, because when everybody's coming to Jerusalem for the Shalosh Regalim, that's when they take their money, their Meiser Sheni that they've been saving, and when they take it with them on their trip to Jerusalem, and that's when they spend their Meiser Sheni money. And you have to assume, therefore, that with the influx of all the pilgrims, the festival pilgrims, so somebody drops some Meiser Sheni money, and that's what the money is. Fine. Okay, if you find meat in the Azar, in the Beis Hamikdash, Avarim olis, so if they are limbs, like Pashit, you find a leg dartin, so you have to assume that it's from an Ola, because a Korban Ola, they would just offer the entire animal, and they would offer the limbs on the Mizbeach. V'chatichos chatos. But if you find cut up meat into cut pieces, well then you assume that it's from a Korban Chatas, because the Korban Chatas is eaten by the Kohanim in the Azar. And therefore, if it was cut up, so you assume that, the Kohanim were preparing it for themselves. But if it's like a whole limb, so then we assume that it's, you wouldn't cut up more than that, for an Ola, you just cut it into limbs. There would be no reason to cut it up into smaller pieces. Therefore, if you find the limb, you assume it's an Ola. If you find pieces of meat, so then you assume that it's a Chatas. Now, if you find meat in the rest of Jerusalem, Zivchei Shlamim, then you assume that it's Shlamim. In Jerusalem, right? Sheqalim, Kalim, you eat in all of Jerusalem. So if you find meat in Jerusalem, you can assume that it is a Shlamim. Yet nonetheless, lemaise, we're going to just let it hang out overnight, become pasul belina, and you're going to burn it, as the Gemara is going to explain, because you don't really know, you've just found this meat. It's possible that it's from yesterday, and it's pasul already because it already had lina, so therefore, so you can't eat it, and to just be sure, you let it hang out overnight. It becomes pasul belina by staying off of the Mizbeach overnight, and then you burn it the next day. Bigvulin, what if you find meat outside of the Yerushalayim? Eivarim nevelis v'chatichos mutaris. So if you find mamish whole limbs of meat outside of Jerusalem, so then you assume that it's nevela, that it's non-shechted meat, or meat that wasn't shechted properly, that somebody just took the limb and chucked it in the street for the dogs to eat. But if it's pieces of meat, so then you can assume that it's kosher meat. Somebody slaughtered an animal, assuming that it's in a place where there's a lot of yidden. You can assume somebody slaughtered an animal, cut it up, and I don't know what happened to the guy, but you can assume that the meat is kosher. Shabbos and Meruba, and during the time of the festivals where there's a lot of meat. And what's interesting is that we had just said that we're talking about outside of Jerusalem, and now we're talking about the festivals. But the note in the R scroll said that it could be talking about people who didn't go to the festival. I think we learned. Where did we learn? Who could remind me? Was it Masechta Pesachim? We learned somewhere that the chiyuv to be ola regel is only if you own property. If you don't own property, like me, I don't own property. So if you don't own property, there's no chiyuv to be ola regel. Although I'm already often in Jerusalem anyways. But so the people who were not ola regel, so then anyway, so if we're assuming that it's talking about outside of Jerusalem, or maybe we could say that the context switched back to Jerusalem, whatever it is, b'shas regel during the festival Shabbos and Meruba, where there's lots of meat around, af evarim mutaris, then even the limbs could be permitted, because there's just lots of meat and limbs and all sorts of stuff. So you can assume that that's also kosher meat. All right. Zog the Gemara lo, or frek the Gemara lo tzorka de lo bahar abayis kodesh. So the Gemara says, one second. So we said that in our Mishnah that if you find money on the Temple Mount, so then it is chulin. The question is, what do you mean? If it's found on the Temple Mount, shouldn't it dafka be kodesh? So Rabba Chia b'shem Rabbi Yochanan chazaka shen hakohen motzi min alishka maos ad shu mechalel and ala behema. Interesting that we can assume that the kohen, when he takes money to buy, from the nedava, from the machzis shekel, he takes that money and he's gonna buy offerings. So you can assume that he's not going to take it out of the office ad shu mechalel and ala behema before he's already transfer the holiness from the coins onto the animal, which means that any coins that you're going to see, practically speaking, on Har Bayis have already been deconsecrated. Okay. Reb Elazar b'shem Reb Hushaya isiya das taun ibr tzura. Okay, says Reb Elazar in the name of Reb Hushaya that if a kohen sort of took his mind off of the animal that he was involved with as a korban, so you have to just let it have ibr tzura. You let it just kind of hang out, not on the mizbeach all night. It becomes pasul belina, and then you burn it. Okay. Amar Bushai Masnisin Amar Kain says. Rabbi Bushai says that our Mishnah says this to b'tzuras of yetzel leveis hasreifa, that if you find any of these limbs or cut up meat in the azara, so you just have ibr tzura or even shlamim meat. We said that you have ibr tzura and then it goes to the Beis HaSeifa. I'm not exactly sure what the proof is from there, but I guess the fact that we have these meat that we don't know what to do with, so we just let them kind of like become pasul on their own after by not being on the Mizbeach the entire night, and then you burn them. Alright. Rabbi Yossi says Rabbi Yossi v'yos, and Ataka makes sense because la'ochel enat yachol shemen eskalkal tzuraso. And it makes sense why, in the case of the Mishnah, when you find meat, then you can't eat it. Even though we said that, if you find cut up meat in the azar, you can assume it's chatas. So why can't you eat it if you're a kohen? Well, because maybe it's from yesterday already, in which case it was already pasul belina. So since we don't know, it makes sense that we say just leave it off of the mizbeach all night. It'll become pasul in the morning by not having been put on the mizbeach, and you'll burn it then. Nimtza begvulin chule. So if you found meat outside of Jerusalem, so Rav Crispa b'shem Rav Yossi Rav Chanina evarim nevelos lokan aleim. So we had said that if you find meat outside of Jerusalem, so if they are limbs, full limbs, we assume that they are nevela, and therefore you were just chucking it in the street for the dogs to eat. Now, if you find them in pieces, you can assume that it's kosher meat, assuming that it's a kosher area. So, says Rav Yosef Rav Chanina, says Rav Crispa in the name of Rav Yosef Rav Chanina, evarim nevelos lokan aleim, that when we say that if you find limbs of an animal, that it's nevela to the extent that if you eat it, you'll get malchus. Right, because of mishum nevela, because of eating nevela. Masnisa Amar Kain, and you can learn this from our Mishnah, which says Ever nevelos v'chtichos mutaros, that it says that the limbs we have to treat as nevelas, but if it's cut up into pieces, we can assume that it is kosher meat. So chatichos mutaros, when we say that the pieces of meat are permitted, lo mamish does not mean that they're mamish permitted. You could mamish eat it. Well, if that's the case, in udchavasa evarim nevelos lokan aleh mishum nevela. Well, if we're saying that when you find pieces of meat, they're mamish kosher, well then we'll say the opposite, which is when you find limbs, they're mamish nevela, to the extent that if you eat them with a warning and everything like that, we are going to whip ya. Reb Crispa b'shem Reb Yossi Reb Chanina says Reb Crispa, the name of Reb Yossi Reb Chanina, im hayu machrozos mutaros. However, if they were a bunch of limbs that were like connected by one rope or something, like a string, all connected to each other, well then you can assume that they were kosher. You wouldn't do that for nevela limbs, and therefore if you find a whole bunch of limbs strung together, you can assume that they're kosher. All right. Now the sugya of teisha chanuyos. This is a gemara that we saw also at the beginning of Masechta Pesachim. Maybe we've seen it in other places as well, but the sugya of the teisha chanuyos. Mochros b'sar nevela v'achas mocheres b'sar shchuta. If you have 9 stores that are selling non-kosher meat and one store that is selling kosher meat, nischalfu lo choshesh. If he went into one of the stores, bought some meat, and now he's not sure which store he went into. So 9 of them are nevela, one of them is shchuta, right? 9 are not kosher, 1 is kosher. So we say, look, since he went into one store, right? So he knows that he went into one store. So that's what's called kavua. That's sort of like a constant. He knows that he went into one store. And we have a concept in halacha of kol kavua k'mechza mechza dami. That whenever you have a constant, whenever you have something fixed, so we treat it as 50%. And therefore, while the conclusion in this case is going to be that you're not allowed to eat it, and you wouldn't be able to eat it anyways because 90% of them, right? If you go based on the majority, you can't eat it because 9 out of 10 were non-kosher. But additionally, in this particular case, because he knows that he went into one store, we apply the concept of kol kavua k'mechza al mechza dami. That when you have something fixed, such as the fact that he knows that he went into one store, one of the 10 stores, so then we apply kol kavua k'mechza al mechza dami, that whenever you have something fixed, we treat it as a 50% probability. And therefore, since there's a 50-50 chance that he went into a kosher store versus a non-kosher store, we have to assume, since we only have 50-50, we have to assume that he may have gone into the non-kosher store, and that's why he's unable to eat it. Okay? It's going to become more relevant in the next case where 90% of them are kosher, but the fact of the matter is, whether 90% are kosher or 90% are not kosher, we still apply the same halacha, which is kol kavua mechza mechza dami, which is since that he knows that he went into one store, we treat it as a 50-50 chance that maybe it's kosher meat versus non-kosher meat, but you can't take that 50-50 chance. There's no majority, and therefore you have to assume that you went into the non-kosher store. You have to be concerned at least that you went into the non-kosher store, and therefore you're not allowed to eat the meat. Well, the nimtzeis, but if you just find a piece of meat on the street, and now you have no clue, did it come from the non-kosher store or from the kosher store, so we go after the majority, right? Holchanach harov, we go after the majority. The majority, right, 90% of the stores are non-kosher, so therefore you may not eat the meat. Now, what happens in the opposite case, which is Tesha Chanuos Mochos B'sar Shchuta V'achas Mocheres B'sar Nevela, when you have 9 stores that are selling kosher meat and 10 stores that are 9 stores that are selling kosher meat and 1 store that is selling non-kosher meat. Nischal fulo choshesh. So now, just like we said earlier, if he went into one of the stores and now he can't remember which of the 10 stores he went into, so he knows that he went into one store, so that's our constant, that's fixed. We know he went into one store, so we apply the concept of kol kavua k'mechza al mechza dami, that whenever you have something fixed, so we have to treat it like 50-50, and therefore even though 9 out of the 10 stores are kosher, we have to treat it as though it was 50-50, and there's a possibility that he bought the meat and the non-kosher butcher, and therefore you cannot eat it. However, if you just find some meat on the street, and it's a place where there's 9 out of 10 of the stores are kosher, well then, Holchanach harov, you can go based on the majority, and you assume that it's kosher meat. Says Rabbi Yochanan, if you find meat in the possession of a non-Jew, so it takes on just whatever the majority, whatever it would be if you just found it on the street, i.e., you go based on majority. If the majority are kosher stores, so then you can eat the meat. You can assume it's kosher. Reb Lazar be Reb Chagai have a masmich l'Reb Mana. So Reb Lazar, the son of Reb Chagai, was supporting Reb Mana while he was walking. And he saw a certain non-Jew who was cutting up strips of horse meat and throwing it into the street. So Amalei Hadaida Amr Reb Yochanan Animtzes bi'anochu kinimtzes beflatia, to which Reb Lazar, Reb Chagai asks, is this what Reb Yochanan meant? That if you find meat by a non-Jew, you can assume that it is, the same halacha as if you just find it in the street, i.e., you could go based on the majority. But we're seeing right over here. Look what this non-Jew is doing. He's putting horse meat on the ground. If we would go based on Rabbi Yochanan, we might think that you can eat this meat because it's based on, if I would find this meat, if I would just see this meat and I wouldn't necessarily see him slicing it from his horse, so I would be inclined to say that it's kosher, assuming that most of the stores around were kosher. And yet, we see right here, look, thank God we saw him in time while he's slicing it up, that it's taka horse meat. So how could Rabbi Yochanan say that we can just assume that meat in the hands of a non-Jew takes on the halachas of like the surrounding stores? What about this guy who's cutting up horse meat? So Amalei, so Rav Mana responds, Kain Amar Rabbi Yossi, Rebbe, so says Rabbi Yossi, my teacher, Ve'en Shiro also Shiotzi Mimakulin She Yisrael. That specifically, if you see the non-Jew coming out of a Jewish market. So if you see a non-Jew coming out of a Jewish market and he has meat, so then you can assume that it's kosher. But yeah, if you just have, I guess, a non-Jew that there's no reason to assume that it's kosher per se, then you probably have to be concerned that it's horse meat. Okay? Chad Barnash b'Tziporin, there was a certain fellow in Tzipori, Azubay Mizbun Kupad min Tabacha v'lo yoevle. There was a certain fellow in Tzipori who wanted to buy meat from a butcher, and the butcher wouldn't sell it to him. Oy vavoy, not very nice. So this fellow said, you know what? If this Yid isn't going to sell me meat, there's a Roman over there. Let me ask that Roman if he can go into the store, ask for some meat. Certainly the butcher will sell meat to this Roman, and then I'll just, get the money, get the meat that way. I'll trick the butcher into giving me meat. So Amalei, so the Roman Taka did that. He went in, got the meat, and gave it to the Yid. So Amalei lenazbis al korche, to which the Yid now runs into the butcher, very proud of himself, and he says, "Ha ha ha ha! Look, I just made you give me meat against your will." Amalei vlav b'sai nevela yoavislei, to which the butcher tries to get the last laugh by saying, "Oh yeah, that I gave the Roman nevela meat." So Rabbi Yirmiyah b'shem Reb Chanina ma'aseh lefnei Rebbe v'amlo kulei monei meser mikulin de tziporin. So Rabbi Yirmiyah said that the story came in front of Rebbe, and he says, "Look, we're not going to make all of the meat in the marketplace in Tzipori forbidden that day." It's not such a clear line. One way is to say that just because that one guy had nevela around doesn't mean that we have to be concerned that all of the shuks in Tzipori have nevela. The other one is to say that maybe he wasn't being truthful. He was just responding to this other guy because they were having an argument or something. So he wasn't going to make all the meat in all the market of Tzipori non-kosher because of this one case that one butcher had some nevela that he gave to a Roman or something. All right, sounds good to me. Well, Chevra, that was Daf Yud Tes of Masechta Sheqalim. So yeah, we talked about when you find things closer. So the interesting rule and the first Mishnah was that you basically go by whatever's closer, but if it's smack in the middle, you have to be stringent. And then we talked about when you find meat in different places. And then, of course, there's pretty famous sugya of the 9 stores. So we saw the concept of kol kavua k'mechza al mechza dami, that whenever you have something fixed, so you have to treat it as a 50-50 probability. But if you just find something randomly, then you go based on the majority. Very cool. All right, Chevra, have a great day. Peace out.